Melissa,
Sarah,
what are we doing today?
we're going to do this podcast thing with a video. Sarah, it is as always like a delight to see you, but all the more because everyone else can see you too.
Yes, we are really going next level here by moving the podcast into the visual realm.
Yes, definitely. A special thank you to Rogers TV for hosting us here, and a really special thank you to Giancarlo for taking an interest in the podcast and being so willing to work with us and take our could read, should read, must read podcast into the television stratosphere.
Woohoo! Yeah, definitely. And for those of you who may be new to this show, I am Sarah.
And I am Melissa.
And we are friends who met grad school in St. John's, Newfoundland in 2007, 2008, and have kept in touch ever since. We've been making our Could Read, Should Read, Must Read podcast since late fall of 2023 in an exclusively audio format. So if you like what you see and hear in this episode, be sure to check us out on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or wherever you download your podcast, because we've got lots of content there that you can enjoy. This is really exciting today to be filming both video and audio. And most people who are familiar with our podcast know how much we love to listen to ourselves and that we're all, kind of sort of our own biggest fans. So, it's exciting that we can all now re-listen and re-watch ourselves. This is excellent.
That's right. Yes, we make no bones about the fact that we love to re-listen to ourselves. And I have spent some time throughout the summer re-listening to some of our existing podcasts. And I started to kind of see a little bit of a theme that I am a little bit of a curmudgeon when it comes to publishers and booksellers. And I keep talking about how they're just out to make a buck. So I feel like I need to kind of clear the air a little bit. And I need to point out that I absolutely love bookstores, actually. I love nothing more than spending a little bit of time in a bookshop, maybe sipping a coffee, looking at titles, that sort of thing. So I did want to make sure I got that out there. I think, like most avid readers, I have fantasies about like owning some little bookstore, probably with some kind of bakery element, and just being surrounded by literature and sugar all day long. So I did want to put that out there and ask you, Sarah, what are some of your favorite bookstores? Tell me about some of the favorite places where you like to buy books.
I love a bookstore and there are so many different types of bookstores out there. And I was thinking about this recently, and kind of my first exposure to a bookstore was a bookstore chain but I think it was a smaller chain, and it was called Walden Books. And I remember going there as a child and just looking at all the different titles and loving the artwork on the books. And our local Walden Books was at this place called the Norrichtown Mall, which now kind of ceases to exist. And that store went out of business years ago. And I think bookstores are really precious, and especially those that are independently owned. And there was a bookstore that was in our local community. I live in Connecticut in the United States. And there was this little town that had like a really cool art culture vibe to it. And they had an independently run bookstore for about 14 years, from 2000 to the end of 2013. And it was called Wonderland Books. And I first encountered that bookstore as, kind of a high school graduate in my early college years. And I used to go with friends. And what I loved about this bookstore is that it was super eclectic, and that you could tell that it was curated, really. So not only just the books and the titles, But even just they had gifts there, really cool, quirky greeting cards if you wanted to be like really original, if you were giving a gift. And the owner, you could tell that she took so much pride in the place. And oddly enough, even though I had encountered it in my, late teens and early 20s, in my late 20s and early 30s, I ended up getting to know the owner because I used to work for a newspaper in newspaper advertising, and she ended up becoming one of my customers. And so I would go to see her like a couple times a month, and I would just go and chat with her. And unfortunately, at the time where she started to advertise with me was at the time when it was just post recession of 2008, and and her business was really not doing great. And of course, that's when Amazon was coming, and a lot of people weren't going to small bookstores, or not even necessarily going to the bigger Barnes and Nobles and Borders and Kohl's bookstores, but they were really kind of going online. And we ended up running a bunch of ads, but the store just ended up closing, and it was really sad. But I ended up getting a bunch of titles from there, and in 2013 there was like a wave of friends, including yourself, Melissa, who had children, and she helped me pick out these really lovely children's books, super unique, that I ended up giving as gifts. And so Violet, your daughter, ended up getting one such book. And I was just racking my brain thinking about it today. And if I remember correctly, and I have a really, oddly strange elephantine memory, but it was Rude Ramsey and the Roaring Radishes by Margaret Atwood. And as both of us being English lit majors and huge fans of Margaret Atwood, I was like, oh, what more perfect book could I have gotten for little Miss Violet as she was entering the world? So
Oh, yeah.
I like that place, even though it's been closed for over 10 years now, holds a special place in my heart. And I think now more than ever, it is important for us to bring our business and bring our thoughts and bring our energy to smaller bookstores. It makes such a big difference. And I don't know. It's just, I feel like as book lovers, we want to see this craft continue. And if it's going to continue, we need to be supporting bookstores. So
Oh,
I'll step
absolutely.
off
Yeah.
my soapbox.
Yeah. It's not a soapbox. It's actually a stack of books that you bought at
Yeah.
independent bookstores. Yeah. No, we of course we have that book, and Douglas has grown to love it over the years too. And it's a really funny read. Like it's a really like energetic kind of book too. And even our kids have kind of used it as an opportunity to come up with their own little stories that have like a lot of alliteration and fun characters. So yeah. Oh, that's great. I love that story. And I love that now we've talked about the bookstores, but now we're talking about the books. Because let's face it, that's where our passions really are, in these stories. And we are about midway through the year at this point. So I'm about 25 books in. I'm not bragging here or anything, but I'm like halfway to my goal, so I'm right on track. And I want to know, what are you reading? But more importantly, what, Sarah, is the best book, the must-read that you have read so far in this year that we have not talked about on the show, which is my casual way of saying don't talk about the Rachel incident, because we've already talked about that one ad nauseum because we loved it so much. Is there anything hot on the heels of the Rachel incident that's a must-read for you so far this year? Or maybe the opposite, a really solid good read?
Well, it's interesting. Of course, the Rachel incident, which I won't talk about in any great detail, was such a great read. And both of us had mentioned it was one of our favorites of the year. And that was way back in late February, early March. But, going into the spring and summer season, I unfortunately ended up on a little bit of a trend of reading some kind of downer books. And it was not my intent, but it slowed my reading pace down, which was really frustrating, because I had felt so great and confident going into this year and going into the center of this year of, like I've been on such a good flow. But yeah, two books in a row that were just super downers. So one of them was a book that I actually bought when we went to Boston. So it was from Beacon Hill Books, and it was called Worry by Alexandra Tanner. And I really feel like a more apt title of the book would have been narcissism because the book was just full of narcissists and people who are victims of narcissists. And it was just, even though there were some real laugh out loud moments when I was, kind of guffawing, and feel like I even sent you screenshots of some passages, I ended up leaving the end of the book. It really made me feel like, oh, and that's such a terrible feeling when you finish a book. You want to be like, oh, because it was so good and you want it to continue. But this one was like, it just ended on such a sour note. So that was a bummer. And then right after that, I ended up picking up a book that I had been really interested in reading. It's called Eileen by Otessa Moshfegh. And that one really should have been a book that I read for our holiday reading episodes that we did as preview episodes when we were launching this podcast, because it is set in the days leading up to Christmas. It's set in like a New England town. And it's just what I picture when I think about the book is when snow gets really dirty. That's the feeling that the book gave me. Like just dirty snow, half melted, piled up on the side of the road. That is the feeling that I got from that book. And it reminded me, like, it was along the vein of like a Patricia Highsmith. But it was really acclaimed too. It was nominated for like the Booker Prize. It ended up winning like the Hemingway Prize. It really, especially after coming off of narcissism, aka worry, I was just like, oh my God, another major downer. And then the third book that I read, which I guess you could also say was a downer, but ended up being, what I would say was probably the best read of the summer thus far, was another book that had been on my TBR list for quite some time, since last year. And it's Paul Murray's The Bee Sting. And this book was a bit of a behemoth, so definitely not a book that you, Melissa, would be probably diving into, because it was about 650 pages.
Oh
but
my gosh.
seriously, like a really long read. And so that ended up taking a long time for me to get through at the beginning of the summer. But it was thought-provoking. It has stayed with me since I finished reading it, probably over a month ago. And it really details the dysfunctional lives of a family living in Ireland post-recession. And it's broken up into 4 different sections. Each of the main characters, it's the Barnes family. And so Dickie Barnes and Imelda Barnes, Cass Barnes, and PJ Barnes, they all get their own sections of the book, and you really get into their POV. It was a challenging read, but again, like I said before, it was a thought-provoking read. I think I had shared with you kind of offline that one of the character sections, the Imelda character, it was all stream of consciousness. So like we're talking no or limited punctuation, no real like sentence or paragraph breaks. And this is, we're talking like 100 plus pages.
Oh my gosh.
So,
I don't know how you survived. Like, how did you not just at one point say, okay, when you've edited this, when you have asked others to proofread, I'd need a semicolon somewhere just to propel me forward.
I know. And it was just that one section that was the stream of consciousness. But, when I really thought about it, it fit the character. It really kind of encapsulated her internal life so well, because this is a person who had come from deep, deep trauma and had really come from poverty, and was someone that was kind of always like on the edge, feeling like their life was going to fall apart at any second. And so you think of that like rapid, kind of fluttering of a hummingbird's wings and how frantic that is. And I feel like the creative choice that Murray made in having the stream of consciousness section for her made so much sense. And I ended up respecting it and appreciating it. And I mean, not to pat myself on the back, but I was really like proud of myself for like sticking through it and reading it and enjoying it too. because it would have been
Why do the
easy.
writers get all the credit? What about the readers? What about
The
really good
readers should
readers?
yeah. Yeah, because one of the main, I mean, it was, I believe, a Booker Prize shortlist for last year. So, I mean, it was very acclaimed book. But I think some of the criticism, especially from, kind of your average reader, would have been like, this was a long book.
Yes.
Maybe could have used with a little bit more editing. But yeah, I wouldn't necessarily call it a must read if I was put on the spot, but I definitely think if you're someone who appreciates a challenge and really loves a deep focus on the inner lives of characters, this would be a should read. So that was a long way of saying probably my favorite book post the Rachel incident, but the year is still, six or so months to go, and we'll see what maybe replaces that. But
Yeah, and two books in our top sort of 5 set in Ireland. So that's an
I
interesting,
know.
unsurprising theme there. I went through a few solid could straddling the should read category earlier in the summer. But in the spring, I read a book that I will definitely give a must read, and really leaning into the visual realm that we're in. I got to figure out my angles here. Greta and Valdin by Rebecca K Reilly. Loved this book. Read it in the spring, actually on the way back from the Boston trip, and we've referenced the Boston trip twice. Sarah and I met up in Boston in May. We have a great book banter episode talking about our reunion there and some of the bookstores that we visited there. If anyone wants to pop over to Spotify or Apple Podcasts to have a listen to that. I loved this book, and I will say it's been a few months, so maybe some of the rougher edges have been smoothed over with time a little bit, that I'm not really recalling them in the same way. But ultimately, I thought this was a smart and humorous book. I felt like the writer really trusted me as a reader. Again, just patting ourselves on the back for how great we are at reading these books. You're welcome, authors.
Yes.
But I really felt like she trusted me, like that she was giving me these sort of complex characters and very offbeat, quirky behaviors, but trusting me to kind of get it and to be able to follow the story and absorb what she was giving to me. So I really appreciated that. And I was nervous because when I opened the book initially, and this is kind of something to do with, I bought this book online, guilty. If I had seen this in a bookstore, I'm not sure that I would have purchased it necessarily, despite its gorgeous cover. It opens with one of these like lists of who all the characters are and what their affiliations are. She actually has 2 characters who have the same name, and I might have been kind of turned off by that. I kind of wish she hadn't included the list at all because it's not necessary. Like the characters are very straightforward in terms of understanding their role in the story. So I was a little bit nervous, but ultimately the story flips between Greta's perspective and Valdin's perspective and their siblings. And I just loved the pacing of this. I was always kind of just ready to hear what Valdin had to say when Greta was finishing up and vice versa. There are 2 sections at the end that she gives the perspective to other people and not the characters you would expect her to. So I also really loved that. But through these 2 voices, we actually get to know a lot of people and a lot of really different people and a lot of different places. It's set in New Zealand. I've never been to New Zealand. I always kind of assume it's a bit like Canada because it has sort of a similar history of colonization and that kind of awkward cousin to a larger neighboring country kind of identity crisis. But it really kind of brought me into that place. I could kind of hear the dialects or the different accents of the place. And I really liked how it just sort of stitched together a lot of moments in daily life, albeit the daily life of like a really, I think quirky's a bit of an understatement. It's a very dramatic family. So it's their daily life, but it's kind of amped up because they are so dramatic. But that all of these moments when they're stitched together, they really accumulate into this illustration of how different people interact with the world and how the world looks and feels to them. And it addresses themes of colonization, immigration, sexuality, generational divide, academia. So I really loved all the characters and how they came together. I felt like I was kind of like just nestled in this little world. And I liked how that kind of reflected my own experience just as a human being, that we should just be watching and understanding other people's behavior to try to figure out what the world looks like to them.
I think any book that really focuses on world building, and especially if it is like a place or space that you're not familiar with, and by the time you get to the end, that you feel like you've gotten to know the characters, but also where they are and what their lives look like and what it really feels like. That's always such a huge accomplishment. And I think really harder to do than one would think.
And I know that I was laughing before about this whole like inner monologue from that bee sting book, but I just am such a fan of these ensemble pieces, right? Like, I mean, I always referenced Arrested Development being one of my favorite shows. Like, I really feel like when authors present how people interact with each other, it's sort of like, it's the opposite of their interior world, but then it's like this sort of filtered version of the interior world. So when it's nicely balanced and blended, you can sort of see why they chose to present themselves in certain ways to certain people, maybe, but you also see their insecurities. I do have a little passage if you'll indulge me.
Oh, I will, of course, indulge you, Melissa.
Okay,
Read away.
I did find it a little bit tricky. I was kind of going through this last night trying to find a section because, like I said, I found it really cumulative. Like, it felt like I needed all of the moments to come together. But then I did find this spot, and I thought it was kind of like a good example of, and also of showing how that, of showing that idea of bearing your insecurities through the narration, but then how they get presented in real life or dealt with. So a few points for context. This is from Greta's perspective. Greta works at a university, so she's pursuing a graduate degree, and she's teaching like intro-level courses there. She does reference a character named Rashmika. That's one of her good friends. Elle is also referenced. This is someone that Greta's in the early stages of a relationship with, and it's also important to know Greta is very tall. Okay, here I go. Okay. It's not a great day at the university or in Greta's life in general, I think. Pouring myself another plastic cup of mysterious punch from a big bowl in the staff common room. Us low-ranked staff members have been allowed in because there's going to be a panel talk, all invited. None of my students had done the readings today, not even the nerdy one with the posh English accent who went to an international school in Singapore. The discussion was bad because everyone was basing their thoughts on my summaries only, and I didn't know what I was talking about either. I don't give a shit about the Merry Wives of Windsor. There are rumors of another department restructuring, and I don't think they'll be choosing me, of all people, to stay on for summer school. The only new job listed today on student job search was selling fireworks, but you needed your own turf. I pour the punch a little too exuberantly, and it spills on the bench. Whoa, calm down, a guy I don't know in shiny brogues and a paisley shirt says, taking an orange slice. I glare at him, drink half the punch, and fill the cup again. I go and stand by Rashmika, who for some reason is having a good time. She's laughing with a guy in an Oxford sweater and burgundy chinos and a girl in a long abstract print skirt and black suede jacket. They're talking about a show I haven't seen. I partially stand in the circle and look down at my clothes I put on yesterday afternoon. I went out after lunch because I didn't want to be alone. I slept on Rashmika's floor because I didn't want to be alone. I just want to see Elle, but I'm embarrassed by the state I'm in. Very emotional, very not clean. I said she could come up and hear about diversity in 19th century literature if she was finished with her plants, but she hasn't been receiving my messages. The little messenger bubble is not filling in. I check my phone again, but there's nothing. Rash, that guy just told me to calm down. Can you believe it, I say? She shrugs. You kind of seem like you need to at the moment. The panel begins and we all sit down on cushioned red and orange metal chairs, the kind that exist in all universities and waiting areas across the country. There isn't enough room for me to sit with Rashmika and the fun television fans, so I have to sit in the back row by myself, which is fine because I'm self-conscious about people not being able to see over me anyway. The panel is comprised of the kind of people you would expect to see at this sort of thing. People who can sit casually in a line knowing we're all looking at them. A confident man with glasses, about 30, who when asked if he knows a particular book says that he hasn't got to it yet, as if he has a towering stack in his house of all the books that people talk about. A girl with a sharply cut wavy bob and a silk floral skirt who speaks like someone from Radio New Zealand, upright consonants piercing her every word. an American lecturer in her 40s with spiky red hair and a purple pashmina worn tightly around her neck. I didn't hear what any of these people's names were, but I assumed they're things like Patrick Bushel, Emma Kennedy Staines, and Anna Rosenfeld. The moderator is a lecturer I had for an undergrad paper where I got a B+ despite not going to the lectures or reading the books. They are all white on this diversity panel. I feel a deep anger bubbling away inside me.
Nice.
I loved it. I loved the book.
I love it.
It was so good. I loved the voices, and I felt like when I closed it at the end, I could have flipped it over and started over again. I think I will read this book again. It was excellent. Must read for me.
That's excellent. Yeah, so not only maybe a must read, but a must reread, which is always nice.
That's a whole other, that's like a whole other series we have to go down. Must read, could read, should read, must read, could reread, should reread, must reread.
This is going to be a real mouthful by the time we're done. And can you tell me, did you use Greta and Valdin to fill in a square for the summer reading challenge?
I did not. I could have. There was like several different boxes I could have,
Okay.
but I'm a purist for the rules, which I made up and have bent for other people. So I don't know why I'm such a purist for them. But I read it before the challenge actually started, so I didn't count it towards it. But I'm glad you're bringing up the challenge, though, because this has been so much fun. Our summer reading challenge has been a great way to bring people together. It's in the bingo style format, like a bingo card with different categories. And I can't believe how many people we're connecting with, how many people are sharing books and titles, and I've been loving it. Are you reading anything that could count towards the summer reading challenge at this point?
Yes, so I have definitely been in earnest, really trying to meet and conquer this challenge, this summer reading challenge. So I currently have 4 completed books on the bingo card. And then I am currently reading one that fits right smack dab in the center of the bingo square of banned book. And that is Philip Roth's Portnoy's Complaint. It's funny, looking at the challenge, not a lot of my TBRs really fit into some of the categories. So I was able to, Eileen, the Dirty Snow book.
We've got, what are your retitles? Narcissism instead of Worry and Dirty Snow book instead of Eileen. You really should go into title writing.
I know. I mean, these just roll off the tongue, don't they? But so that book I was able to put under our, kind of award-winning book. I was a little creative with that because we did kind of say it was, I'm not a stickler, obviously, for the rules, but we did say preferably like New York Times or Globe and Mail bestseller. Oh, no, I'm thinking of a different category, which I have a book for that, a Stephen King book that I fit in for that. But it was an award, not a bestseller, but an award-winning book. And so it wasn't a Booker or Giller Prize winner, although it was shortlisted for the Booker. But it was, as I mentioned previously, it was a Hemingway Prize winner. So I was able to fit that in. I had a Stephen King book for the New York Times slot that we have. And then the bee sting ended up in a place that I've never visited, which is Ireland. Unfortunately, I've never been there. So that long 650-page book, not only did I pat myself on the back for actually just completing it in general, but I was also able to fill in a bingo square, which was nice. And so, and then the other book that I just completed just a couple days ago was Fear of Flying by Erica Jong. And so that book, as well as Philip Roth's Portnoy's Complaint, and then a third book that I kind of have waiting in the wings. I've gotten it from the library, which is The Unbearable Lightness of Being by Milan Kundera, are all books that have been written like 40 plus years ago. And I thought, well, since I didn't have books on my TBR that were fitting naturally into our contest, I thought, well, why not use this as an excuse to kind of explore some kind of cultural themes and the decades of, in particular, the 1960s and the 1970s, which are depicted in these books. The Philip Roth book, I'd never read a book by Philip Roth. And as a, English major, I kind of feel a little shame around that because I feel like everyone probably should have read Philip Roth at some point. And so I'm finally going to be checking that off my list. Um, and so, yeah, I figured it was time to kind of start getting a little bit creative with this and, kind of expand and not just be reading books that have been written in the last, like, 2 to 5 years, but like kind of go back and, take a look at some different authors and are there notable books that I've heard of that could fit into these categories a little bit more easily that I actually have a real interest in reading and it's a little bit more of a natural fit. So yeah, long way of saying yes, I am fitting books into our challenge squares.
Well, and we talked about this at the beginning of the year too about, what our reading goals were, not in terms of like numbers. And even though I made a joke earlier about being halfway to my like 50 books of the year, but we talked a lot about just books putting us in conversations with people and conversations with each other like this. But then through the podcast and through our social media profiles and stuff, or social media channels, I guess. We've been connecting with people, and it's been funny to see like someone else, actually your cousin added a Philip Roth book to her bingo card, and sometimes like dipping into those books that are older, even though they might not be contemporary, current, sort of active, timely conversations, the older books put us into sort of a longer conversation, and we also get to kind of see how that book has had what its longevity has been like, how people have received it over time too. So no, I think that that's really cool. And it does kind of capture the spirit of the challenge too, right? To push our boundaries a little bit, read things that maybe we don't necessarily want to read, or maybe that we haven't been compelled to read thus far. But then also maybe tick a few things off of our TBR while we're at it, which I've been joking about this, that I'm the one who made the categories and then didn't take into account my own TBR, which would have been a very effective way for me to design the challenge.
Really been a ringer for this, but instead you wanted to be fair.
That's right. I do it for the fans. But I am reading for the book that counts towards the book in another language or a translation. I am reading My Brilliant Friend by Elena Ferrente, which was gifted to me by a brilliant friend, Kate Pendakis, which is really great. I'm only about a quarter of the way into it, so I really can't give much information on this. But I wanted to bring up the fact that I was interested in translations because I had talked about Before the Coffee Gets Cold, and I was a little bit critical of the quality maybe of the translation, and I felt like there was a distance between the writer and the version that I was reading. And someone who follows us on social media, she goes by Laura K in the Instagram world. I can only assume her name is Laura and her surname starts with a K in the physical world. But she saw like something I posted that just had the spine of that book, and she made a comment about how much she loved it. And I said, yeah, I'm going to use it for the translation square. And she said, oh, it doesn't read like a translation. It's so poetically written. And it's been a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. Like the way that I've come into the book is like, oh, this is a really good quality translation, and it's not going to read like a translation. So I have been kind of feeling really positively about that. But interestingly, the way that the writer talks about maybe how language and class overlap is really direct. So rather than making some attempt at reproducing language that would reflect that style of speech, she just comes right out, or the narrator comes right out and says, and they spoke this in the way that would be used in the streets or something. It's like really on the nose. And that's really made me kind of think about what would this look like in English, right? If this was a book that was written in English about different dialects of English or different manners of speaking, how would it look? And of course, as someone who lives in Newfoundland and has now collectively lived in this province for 17 years, not in a row, but 17 collective years, and you've spent a great deal of time here as well. The Newfoundland dialect, the Newfoundland dialects, plural, very tricky to capture on a page. And I don't know if you've had any experience with like reading books that try to capture it. And in my experience, they sort of either are incredibly successful or just like pathetic failures. I don't know how you feel about it.
Yeah, I do really feel like, in my experience, attempts at depicting dialect or accents, it can be a mixed bag. And when it works, it really works. And it is immersive and can really transport you to the place. And, I think with like Newfoundland literature, when it is done well, and especially I feel like what's interesting is if you're somewhat familiar, Like if you have a family member or you've spent time living somewhere and you've been able to pick up on dialects and accents and language, then I think sometimes you're a little bit harder to please with that and how it's depicted in literature, if that makes sense, because you have an affiliation with it. And so if what you're reading doesn't really match with what you're familiar with, then it can kind of take you out of the experience and make you think, oh, this doesn't feel right, this doesn't feel authentic. But then on the reverse of that, if you're not from somewhere, and even talking about like New Zealand, like although we may have some ideas about what that culture looks like based on the idea of being in Canada and being part of the Commonwealth or whatever. But we don't know exactly what that it feels like to listen to people from New Zealand and what the different dialects and accents are. You may be a little bit more flexible and a little bit more accepting, possibly. So I don't know. I think it really truly is something that it can really work, and it can really, again, like the idea of scene setting. I think it can really put you there, or it can take you way out of it.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, it can really interrupt that immersive experience. So, no, I totally agree with you. And I'm excited to see what My Brilliant Friend has to offer. It has a really good hook. It definitely, the tension is established early on. This is the first book of a series as well. So it opens up with this sort of, like I said, this tension building, and then it rewinds you right back to the two main protagonists as children. So then you realize, okay, we're gonna get a full development story, this sort of Bildungsroman, if I may throw out a little bit of vocabulary here.
Nice usage.
Really,
yes.
really wow the listeners with that. But as we approach September, as we approach back to school, I should point out I also love fall as much as I love summer. And I love the idea of back to school because I love when our pencils are the sharpest and our notebooks are the freshest. So with that in mind, Sarah, I want to ask you to assign me some homework. I want to kind of set this as this midway point of the year. Our plan is to do another year-end roundup like we did in 2023. I want to do the same thing for 2024. So what book are you going to assign to me now to read that we'll come back to in another 6-ish months as part of the year-end roundup to chat about?
Well, don't worry. It's not going to be the bee sting. I would not do that to you, my friend. But because I love having a shared read with you, because I love it when we can kind of go back and forth and talk about characters and talk about plot and what we loved and what we didn't like, what worked for us and what didn't. I'm going to actually assign you a book that I have yet to read, but plan on reading before the end of the summer.
Bold move.
And I feel like if maybe we can both read it at some point this summer. We'll see. I know you're going on a vacation soon, so possibly then. But the book that I am going to assign you, and I guess assign myself, giving myself homework, is All Fours by Miranda July.
Love it.
And we did have a previous very snippet of a conversation about this book before. You had asked me if I had read it yet because you knew that it was on my list. But this has been a much buzzed about, I would say, like read of the summer. And it explores, from what I can tell from the descriptions that I've read, what it is to be a woman, what it is to be a wife, what it is to be a mother, what it is to be an artist in midlife, and maybe some of the interesting paths that can be taken. And I've heard that it is quite spicy, which I know you and I are both not afraid of a little bit of spice. However, when we do our year-end roundup, we may very well need to put a content warning on that episode and also ask our mothers not to listen. So that's going to be
we're really generating some buzz here for sure. Like even by already pointing up that there could be like an explicit warning. We've already got listeners ready lined up.
And that will be a book banter episode. We do sometimes imbibe while we are having a book banter episode, and I think that book will lend itself well to a little boozy banter. So there you go.
Yeah, that sounds fun. I'm already looking forward to that. Yeah, thank you for picking that one because that one's definitely one that I wanted to check out and have heard a lot about. And I felt myself when you were saying, oh yeah, book of the summer, lots of buzz. I felt myself and my cynicism starting to bubble up that I was going to be like, that's just because the publishing industry has marketed it well. And I was like, no, Melissa, you already undid this statement. Why are you starting all
No,
over
you
again?
already tried to correct that at the very beginning of this.
I thought I had undone all of that nastiness that I had said and revealed about myself with the publishers, but I guess old habits die hard. But in any case, speaking of marketing, folks, I do want to mention a book that I would put on your task list, on your assignments for the back to school, that does feature some ad execs, I guess, is that the term? It is a book called Cleopatra and Frankenstein, and I read this summer. I feel like I would assign it to you to read, not because it is a must-read, but rather because I want all of my feelings about this book to be validated. And I have lent this book. I have lent this book to someone else already for them to validate my feelings about it, and it worked. But it was like a ridiculous encounter. So I will just like go off script here a moment to tell this anecdote because I do find it funny. Talk about interior worlds. If I were to write a book, it would be like The Bee Sting, just thousands of pages of just no punctuation whatsoever, inner monologue. But I was going to a birthday party. A friend of mine was having a birthday event, and I knew I would see another one of our friends there, and I had told her that she should read this book, or I think she saw I had posted about it and was curious. So I go to the birthday party, and the person I'm giving the book to and the person whose birthday it is are arriving together at the same time. So I encounter them both at the same time. And so the birthday girl, I hand her her birthday card, which, just to be fair, like, it's a pretty lame gesture. It's literally a folded piece of paper. I mean, it was a legit greeting card I had purchased somewhere, but, you know, generally speaking, cards maybe not the most thoughtful of things to give. So I hand her a card, and then I realize I have like a way more substantial item to give to our friend who's there, whose birthday it is not. So now I'm giving like basically a gift to the non-birthday person and also giving her a card at this point as well. But just to make things a little bit more interesting, it is a Christmas card that I am giving her because I had found it from Christmas on the top of my fridge and was like, I'm gonna see Shelly tonight at Lindsay's birthday thing, so I'll give her her Christmas card then. So like, I just feel like this type of thing happens to me all the time, that I'm like, I'll do a nice thing. I will give someone a book, and then I end up in these strangely embroiled in these kinds of bizarre scenarios. So all of this to say, I have like an awkward, very gauche moment at this birthday party, and then I hand off the book to my friend and basically say, I only liked the first third of this. The rest is like not great reading, but I just want you to find that out for yourself and then agree with me. So then we started exchanging what we ended up calling book roast texts about the book as it got like sort of progressively worse throughout the book. So it starts out so strong. I really can't overemphasize that. Like the first third of the book, I was like, oh baby, we are cooking with gas. Like I was really into it. It starts with like almost a meet cute situation. It evolves into this green card marriage, and the characters are complicated but charming. It's a really interesting read to begin with. And then the author introduces like 900 other characters who are kind of unnecessary. And the whole time you're kind of wondering, what happened to those other two? Like, they were really interesting. Can we go back to them? And then when you do go back to them, they have spiraled into places that are really kind of strange and unusual and not provoking in a way that advances the story. And I think this goes back to something you were talking about in the book that you so aptly retitled Narcissism. These insufferable characters, and you just feel like you're stuck with them, and you just start to hate them and think like, just knock some sense into yourself. What is going on with you? And then, yeah, you're judging them, and so then you don't like how you feel because you're judging their behavior, and then you remind yourself they're imaginary. But really, these characters by the end of it had really gotten on my nerves. But there is one character who saves the day, her and her mother, with the most hilarious hot takes, and the way that they're structured in the book is literally like 5 or 6 lines. I call them like these little sound bites, and they're so hilarious and they're so accurate and fun to read and like really clever, I guess, that this one character, Eleanor, and her mother sort of like a phoenix from the ashes, really, really salvaged this book. So I think that if you wish to take on this task, to read it, to just basically agree with my take on it, and I hope you do love Eleanor as much as I did.
Well, do you happen to have any Eleanor bits that you would like to share as like a
Did you
little juicy
spot?
preview?
Did you spot my tabs?
Ooh, I
Is that
do.
what?
Nice. I love a tab.
I do have a couple because they are so short, but I do think they kind of show like the type of voice. And I actually, now that I'm about to read them, they do kind of resemble the tone in Greta's portion that I read. So I think it'll be indicative of what I'm sort of into. So this is just like maybe 10 lines from Eleanor. I might pull a couple more because they are so funny. It says, everyone I know is either more successful or more interesting than me. This realization is nothing new. In fact, it used to feel like everyone I didn't know was more successful and interesting than me too. I still remember the sensation of watching a talent show on TV as a child and realizing that the girl dancing was a whole year younger than me. She was wearing a red sequin dress and patent tap shoes. She looked like a ruby, a human jewel spinning across the stage. I was in pajamas from TJ Maxx eating cereal for dinner, already destined for a life of mediocrity. Why didn't I just pull myself together back then? I was 5. I could have turned it around.
That's my feelings about Beyonce, oddly enough. Like
Yes,
I
tell me
remember there
more.
being a time in my like late teens, early 20s, and I was like, Beyonce is, like the same age as me. Like, look at what she's doing. Look what I'm doing.
Hey, you have a show on Rogers TV. You and
I do.
Beyonce are in the same playing field as far as I'm concerned.
Definitely. Without a doubt.
Well, Sarah, this has been, as always, delightful, but I do feel like we've upped the ante a little bit here by having this visual. And I'm so grateful for this opportunity. I loved this conversation. I can't wait to start all fours and then be able to chat about it with you again. Thank you for this.
Thank you, Melissa. This was a blast. We are entering a new phase of Could Read, Should Read, Must Read. And I'm happy to be on this ride with you, my friend.
Till next time.
Bye-bye.